I'm a 42-year-old woman with a fairly normal life. I want to make it clear, I don't mean normal in a bad way either. I've always planned for my life to be fairly average, if you will. I'm just not the kind of person that has super extravagant dreams I want to accomplish. I've always been the sort of person who is completely okay with having an office job and working an 8-to-5 workday. Sometimes I wondered why I never had the ambition to be great like other people did growing up, but I figured it must have been because my parents were also just fine with ordinary lives. This specific situation happened when I was 40 and working in an accounting office as a secretary/receptionist. It was quite boring work, but I really didn't mind. It was only some hours out of my day and the pay was fairly decent as well. There was, however, one con to this job, and that con was a man named Gary. Gary had joined the company a few years back. I had been working there for about 5 years by this time, and I'd seen many a person come and go. I never really expected anyone to stay for very long, given the fact that the building wasn't very nice. I also knew for a fact that the assistant position he was filling in for one of the accountants did not pay well at all. I kind of felt bad for him at first, to be honest. He was very optimistic about the job and super excited, but by the time a full year had passed, he was obviously very sad and bored. I guess feeling bad for him is what made me try to befriend him in the first place, and that's something I'll regret forever. Gary was a nice and seemingly regular guy at first. We went off for lunch a couple of times a week as friends, and sometimes went for a drink after work. Now, let me tell you, Gary was extremely boring, possibly the most dry and unfunny person I've ever met. All he'd ever talk about was himself and his cats. I mean, there's only so many times you can hear a person talk about their cat's favorite toys and treats before you just want to bury your head in the sand. It was painful, but I continued my friendship with him because I knew I was the only friend he had. I would have hated to hurt his feelings at the time. After around 6 months of us being friends and spending short periods of time together outside work, I noticed Gary becoming very clingy. He would text me during my days off to ask where I was and if I'd meet him for lunch and drinks, and when I politely said no, he'd get extremely angry. It was our tradition. I couldn't mess up our tradition, and stuff like that. The other thing he really hated was whenever I mentioned my husband. He really hated that. If we were having a conversation and I ever brought it up, Gary would scoff and ask to change the subject. If he asked to get lunch with me and I told him I had plans with my husband, he'd actually tell me to cancel them with my husband so I could go with him instead. I found this extremely strange, obviously. Eventually, he just became this person who was trying his best to control me. Only, Gary was just a guy I worked with. It's not like he could tell me what to do, so I just started to ignore him. One day, however, he overheard me talking to another coworker about a barbecue I was having at my house that coming weekend that my husband and I were hosting. I had actually asked the other coworker not to mention it because I didn't want Gary to know about it. Of course, he found out though. She basically yelled across the whole office how excited she was to the barbecue and how happy she was to be invited. Well, there's that, I guess. As expected, Gary came rushing up to me with an angry look on his face. He began littering me with questions on why he wasn't invited and if I hated him now. He was talking so fast I couldn't even get a word in if I wanted to. Finally, I just ended up raising my voice and telling him to shut the fuck up. He didn't like that, but I followed the shut up with an invite to the barbecue. I kind of had to invite him at that point. I made up some dumb excuse as to why I hadn't done so, with something like, "Oh, I wanted to invite you in person." He bought it, of course, which was all that mattered. In my head, the barbecue was already ruined just by the fact I knew he'd be there. The weekend rolled around and my husband and I were setting up. It was pretty hot outside and we had a swimming pool we'd set up to utilize that day. People started to arrive and we began cooking hamburgers and hot dogs. After an hour, Gary still hadn't showed up. I was really hoping that meant he wasn't going to. There he was though, stepping into our backyard from the side gate, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and to everyone's shock and horror a Speedo. I was confused and upset. I felt like walking over and telling him to leave, but I convinced myself causing a scene would have been a bigger issue and I should just let it go for a while. After a while, our daughter came home and joined the party as well. She was 16 at the time. Most of her time during the barbecue was spent sunbathing by the pool. I began to notice Gary staring at her, which of course I found creepy. I walked up to him and asked him what he was doing, but instead of answering, he just pointed at my daughter. The words that came out of his mouth disgusted me. Who is she? Oh my God, the things I'd do to that girl. The anger I felt in that moment was so intense I could barely find the words to tell him to get out. Instead, I went over to my husband and told him what Gary said. I watched my husband storm over to him. I didn't hear what was said between them. Instead, I saw Gary storm out of our backyard and yell some expletives before closing the gate. I asked my husband what had happened, but his only response was that he'd handled it. For the next few weeks, work was normal. Beside the occasional glares I received from Gary, I didn't care though. I was just glad to have him out of my life. After work, he would always watch me walk to my car. I found this unnerving, of course, but I tried not to think about it too much. Gary had become known for being a little creep around the office, so this was normal in everyone's minds. He tried texting me multiple times to apologize, but I ignored him. I was done with our friendship, if you could even call it that. I just wanted him to leave me alone. About a month after the barbecue, my daughter started complaining to me that whenever she was in her room, she felt like someone was watching her. Every time I went in there, she had the curtains fully closed. She said it was the only way she felt safe. I felt bad for her, but we could never catch anyone looking into her window, so there wasn't much we could do other than tell her we'd keep her safe always. One day, though, everything changed. My husband always picked up our daughter from school after soccer practice, but this day he happened to be running a little bit late. When he pulled up, he noticed a car pulled up beside her. She had already opened the door and was about to get in. My husband yelled out of the window and asked her what she was doing. Almost immediately, the car sped away, leaving our daughter standing on the curb of her school, confused. What she told my husband shook me to my core. She said after she'd gotten done with soccer practice, she went to the front of campus where she usually met my husband and waited for him to get there. He didn't think to text her at the time that he was running late, as she was waiting nonetheless. She knew he'd be there eventually. Instead, though, Gary pulled up in front of her, told her he was my friend and that he was told to go pick her up. Of course, that wasn't true at all, but she'd seen him around before and assumed he must be telling the truth. That's when she opened the door and was about to get in. After she told my husband what happened, he called the police, who managed to actually track down Gary. He was charged with attempted kidnapping, and when they searched his car, they found duct tape, rope, and zip ties, as well as over 100 pictures of her in her bedroom and at her school. They said he'd been stalking her for the past month, and this must have been thoroughly planned. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison eventually, as well as receiving a no-contact order. His 2-year sentence went by fast, and he's out now. We changed houses and had her switch schools just in case. So far, we haven't seen him around. We don't know what he had planned for her that day, but we're glad we never had to find out. This story took place maybe 10 years back, so if things sound a little bit weird at times, it's because my memory of the incident has gotten a little fuzzy over the years. I'll try my best to give the best detail possible though. At the time, I was 22 years old and had just started working reception in a marketing office. I was trying to pay my way through college, and this seemed like as good a job as any. I remember my first day very well, because everyone was so inviting and sweet. Almost everyone came up to my desk to say hi and introduce themselves. It was great actually. I thought I was going to fit in there perfectly, since everyone seemed so normal and nice. As the months went on, I made many friends as well. They were all older than me, but that didn't seem to matter much in an office setting. It was a little bit hard to relate sometimes when the older women would talk about their kids and grandkids when I was still only in college. Even though I had a few close friends at the office, I was at least acquaintances with almost everyone else. Almost. There was one man who worked with us named Enzo. He was interesting to say the least. Everything about him was very routine-based. He'd walk into work every morning at 8:10 on the dot. He walked the same path to his desk, organized his pens the same way every day. When he picked up the phone, he would always tap it 5 times. Let me make this clear, these are just examples. I don't remember every single routine he did, but it was always stuff like this. There were a bunch of little things, too. What I do remember noticing the most was that there were only a few particular groups of people in the office he would ever talk to. I ended up asking my friend Alex about what was going on. I can't say I was very surprised when he told me Enzo had a severe form of OCD. He told our boss about it when he'd started working. Our boss told the other employees just to be sure they could be patient with him, instead of getting upset at his quirks. Over the years since Enzo had started working there, many of the original employees had since quit, retired, or been promoted to another position outside our building. Because of this, the only people left for Enzo to talk to were the original employees, 3 of them who'd been working with him since his very first day. Since he had such a strict routine, he couldn't bring himself to introduce himself to every new employee that walked in. I guess Enzo had even told the boss about this, who understood. As long as he did his job, he didn't have to go out of his way to trouble himself. I tried to introduce myself to him a few times before learning anything about him. I just figured he was rude and ignoring me, but after hearing this, it made me rethink my stance. I felt bad for judging him without knowing anything about him. Everyone knew about Enzo and what he was dealing with mentally. We all worked hard to make a work environment that was safe for him. We tried not to get in the way of his routine, and whenever any of us needed something from him, we made sure to ask one of the people he talked to relay the information to him. It always worked out well, and it was pretty smooth for a while. That was except for one day, when our boss had a client come into the office instead of meeting him for lunch like he usually did. This specific client was a big hassle as well. I'd met him once before. Just super annoying person, very loud and intrusive as well. He had no respect for personal space at all, which frustrated us more than anything. We'll call this man Mark. Well, Mark came in one day, and of course it was hard not to notice him. He flung open the doors and started screaming across the room for our boss to come out and greet him. I tried politely asking him to sign into the office, but he just laughed at me and started to rampage throughout it. He went over to almost everyone, asking if they were going to take good care of him. I could tell he was making everyone else just as uncomfortable as he was making me. It was only when we saw him all stomping his way over to Enzo that I really started to worry. I watched as Mark sat down on the edge of his desk and started patting Enzo's head. "Having a good day, buddy?" He was messing up his hair in the process. I could see Enzo's face turning as he did this. Mark started ruffling through the papers on Enzo's desk. This is when multiple of my coworkers got up and asked Mark to stop messing with him. Come on, if he had a problem, he could tell me himself. At that point, he began playing with Enzo's pens as well, and basically laughing in his face. I guess Enzo had had enough. He stood up and screamed in Mark's face, pushing him off the desk. And that's when things started to get a little violent. Mark was now on the ground, and we all watched in horror as the normally peaceful Enzo began kicking and punching him as hard as he could, landing brutal blows against the side of Mark's head. He got 10 good hard kicks, as well as some stomps in before someone ended up pulling him away. He didn't like that either, since he hated being touched, which led to him lashing out at everyone around. No one could get him to calm down. I guess at some point during the scuffle, someone had called the police. They ended up coming through the doors soon, and all I could do was point towards Enzo and Mark's destroyed body laying on the ground as he took short, shaky breaths. They arrested him for assault, and the paramedics came and sorted out Mark. He went to the hospital. We were informed he had a severe concussion, A couple of his ribs had been broken, and Enzo had even punctured his lung. He ended up suing, but the trial didn't go anywhere once the footage of the incident and context of Enzo's mental illness was brought to light. Unfortunately, Enzo was fired, and although I had this feeling he would have quit anyways, we all felt bad for him. If Mark had just left him alone, he could have kept the job he had gotten used to for so many years and been a peaceful, kind man the entire time. The 3 employees he talked to did end up keeping in touch with him. I was happy to hear he'd got another job that didn't mind his routine-based lifestyle either. I quit about 4 years back, but to this day I still think about Enzo often and wonder what he's up to. I hope Mark learned his lesson as well, and that everyone reading this can take away the fact that you really shouldn't intentionally mess with anyone. They might be the calmest person ever, but you never know what they're going through, and what you're doing can have a bigger impact than you ever think it might. I'm 32, and at the time of this story, I worked in a fairly busy office setting. I won't bore you with the details of my job, but I will tell you it's incredibly average and not at all what I envisioned for myself when I used to think about what I'd be doing in my adult life. Everyone always told me college was the answer to getting a good-paying job doing something I loved, but after I graduated, I was $100,000 in debt and couldn't find a job in the field I'd gone to school for. I guess I just had to settle, and let me tell you, I was not happy about it at all. I felt lied to, like everyone who told me college would lead to this amazing life had just played a huge prank on me that cost me years of my life and thousands of dollars. I was angry. My work consists of a lot of paperwork and phone calls, and it makes everything super boring. Not just boring, but also sad. Sad at how my life has led me here. I get that some people who strive for these jobs are perfectly happy in them, but I'm just not, and I'm sure that comes across in my attitude every day. I actually know it must, because most of my coworkers don't like me for whatever reason. My boss actually told me once that he would have fired me just because of my attitude and what he called a lack of consideration for my colleagues if I wasn't so darn good at my job. Of course, I hated it so much that if he did fire me, I really wouldn't care. I'd just find another job somewhere else, probably still doing something I hated. I will say, though, that I do realize now it wasn't right for me to take out my own internal anger on my coworkers. I should have realized that at the time, but I kind of liked that they all avoided me. I was a total introvert, and socializing is not my strong suit anyways. So if my attitude kept them at bay, that was just fine with me. My only issue was I wasn't just inconsiderate, but also plain rude at the time. I knew everyone called me the office bully, but a part of me found that amusing. I thought it meant that everyone hated me. Thinking back on it now, I guess it was because I was legitimately mean. I had issues building up inside me, and I guess subconsciously I wanted to bring everyone else down with me, just as a bully does. I hate even admitting that right now, but I have to be real, and what I say next is the reason for what happened to me. I sometimes made fun of people at work, not just under my breath or behind their backs, but to their faces as well. I laughed and joked about how people looked and what they ate or what clothes they wore. If someone was having a hard time at work, I thought it was funny to call them stupid, stuff like that. I know it was wrong, but at the time, I just wanted people to feel the torment I felt in my own mind and body. People used to tell me I was hurting their feelings and I should realize the consequences of my actions, but I usually just laughed off their concerns. I spent a lot of time in HR, but I guess I must have been an asset to the company because I was always just warned and never got in trouble. This specific day, I was in the break room eating lunch when one of my coworkers walked in. The second she saw me, she rolled her eyes and went to the fridge. I'm changing her name for the sake of the story, so we'll call her Angela. Angela was a heavy-set woman, and I guess that day that's what I decided to make fun of. She'd brought a leftover pizza for lunch and was heating it up when I made some awful comment that was something like, "Do you really need to be eating that?" I laughed about it in the moment, but now I just feel cringe and disgust after thinking about it. The look on her face is something I'll always remember. Everyone in the room went silent as tears began to stream down her face and she ran out of the room. Everyone else looked at me with such anger and disappointment that I didn't know what to do other than get up and walk out and back to my desk. That moment was almost like an epiphany for me. I actually started to see that the way I was treating people was wrong. I wanted to go over and apologize, but I knew it wasn't the right time. She was surrounded by a group of people trying to console her. All I wanted to do was shrivel up into nothingness for what I'd done to a woman who had never been rude to me or anyone in her whole life. The next day, I came into the office and put my lunch in the fridge as I usually do. As the morning went on, no one would talk to me or even look at me. It was like I was being shunned, but I knew I deserved it. The guilt I felt was intense, and I wanted nothing more than to take back all the awful things I'd said. But there was no fixing these relationships. These people knew me as the office bully, and that's exactly what I was. Around 11 a.m. that morning, I decided I really needed to apologize. I made my way over to her desk and began to apologize, but she wouldn't even look at me, which made me feel even worse. I went back to the break room and went to retrieve my lunch. I decided to eat at my desk to avoid everyone else, who didn't even bother to hide their mean stares. I opened the Tupperware and began eating my pasta, but something seemed a bit off. It was crunchy. I knew I hadn't put anything crunchy in there. That's when I looked down, horrified at what was in my container and what I'd just eaten. Peanuts. I'm deathly allergic. If I don't have my EpiPen within minutes, I will die, literally life or death. I felt the tingle in my tongue, and my heart began to race. I rushed into my desk drawer, only to find my EpiPen was no longer there. And that's when I went to full-blown panic mode. I only had a couple of minutes before I wouldn't be able to breathe. I knew the office kept an emergency first aid kit on hand, and the office was required to keep an EpiPen on hand at all times. I ran into my boss's office in the most hoarse voice imaginable, throat already closing as I tried to tell him what was happening. Everything seemed to be in slow motion at this point. My tongue had already begun to swell, and breathing was a struggle. Everyone was staring in horror. Everyone except for Angela. Even in that moment where I was fearing for my life, I noticed she was the only person still working. My boss found the EpiPen hidden away shortly after I burst into his office. I administered it to myself straight in my thigh. An ambulance was called and I was taken to the hospital for further evaluation. After telling my boss what happened, we both suspected someone had intentionally put peanuts in my lunch in order to force me to have an allergic reaction. Only we couldn't exactly pinpoint who, since everyone at the office hated me so much and no one would fess up. Eventually, because there was no progress, the case was closed. No one ever admitted to it, but I gotta say my gut tells me to this day it was Angela. She never cared about what happened to me after, and was the only one never to bother to ask me what happened either. I got laid off a couple of weeks after, with them now using examples of my poor behavior to finally get rid of me. I ended up getting another desk job in the same kind of work, but now I do my best to treat people with kindness and sincerity. I realized it took me way too long to understand that everyone deserves kindness. There's enough negativity in the world already. If any of you are out there though, be careful who you treat poorly, especially if they have access to what goes into your body. You never know what could push them over the edge into harming you.